I tell you, in fact, it's two books I would recommend.
Two books.
Two for people who really want to understand what is called the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's a misnomer, but nevertheless, who want to understand. Modesty forbade me from publicizing my own book, but I'm going to do it now because, in a way, this book, Married to Another Man, you see, Married to Another Man, which I published in 2007, and then Ilan Pappé's 10 Myths About Israel, much more recently, I think probably tell you the story. I was writing from a Palestinian point of view, and he is, of course, writing as an Israeli commentator, an anti-Zionist Israeli commentator. Tariq was talking about the misconceptions around Winston Churchill and the way people have got him wrong and the kind of mythology that's been created about him. I can only tell you, multiply that by 10 or to the power n, and you get an idea of the obfuscation, misunderstanding, ignorance about the Palestine story. It's been one of the most difficult things for people who defend the Palestine cause to try and work their way through the wall of incomprehension, of prejudice, of even received wisdom. Like, for example, the only solution to the problem is the two-state solution, which we're stuck with. It's really hard to do that, but one has to do it in order to understand what really happened in Palestine when Israel was created. And my book talks about it from my point of view, or from the Palestinian point of view. Ilan's book, Ilan Pappé's book, very admirably charts the so-called myths that have been created about the situation in Israel-Palestine. And he's taken it into he's done it under 10 headings of frequently heard stuff about this story. Like, for example, Palestine was an empty land when the Jews arrived. The Jews were a people without a land. That's another one. And this is very important, that Zionism is Judaism. And I want to pause here because this is so important for what is happening in the Labour Party and the anti-Semitism witch hunt. Because if you equate Zionism, that's the ideology of the Israeli state, with Judaism, which is the religion of Jewish people, then what you've got is what we've seen that destroyed Jeremy Corbyn, and it is ongoing, which is that if you criticize Israel, a modern state which breaks the law and violates human rights norms, if you criticize it, you are in effect criticizing Judaism and Jews. Great triumph for the Zionist movement, and that's where we are now. So therefore, if you dare to actually criticize, as I say, Israel, you run the risk of being yourself attacked for anti-Semitism. Now, in my view, that is the latest in a series of deliberately designed campaign to obscure what really happened, how Israel came into existence, what Israel is, and how it behaves. It's a series of renewals of false representations of the reality in order to shield people from knowing about what Israel really is and how it came into being. So the important thing is, and I know that I'm not saying anything new to many people who are listening to this, because you will know that Israel came into being very violently and at the expense of the indigenous, the native population in 1948. That's as simple as. And Zionism is a colonialist movement. It's a settler colonial movement whose aim was to expel the native population and take their place. That's what it's about. Now, the moment one has that in one's head, then one can interpret all the events that come after that through that prism. You really understand what that's about. Now, once you also add that reality is very unappealing and unattractive in a modern world where colonialism had been in decline when Israel was created, you understand that the settler colonists had to create a mythology about what they were doing, which would then obscure the truth about what they were doing. And honestly, that is the story of the situation in Israel-Palestine. And one reason I object to the word conflict, it's not a conflict. You don't have a conflict between a colonized people and a colonizer. That's not the appropriate term. It's not, as you know, conflict suggests two equal parties and they've disagreed about something, and what they need to do is get around a table. It is not at all the situation in Israel-Palestine. And the Palestinians have paid a very, very heavy price for the creation of Israel and continue to pay for its sustenance and its prosperity as a settler colonial state which enjoys the support of the Western world. Now, I just repeat, I just go back again to the myths about Israel, as I mentioned earlier. In order to make the world swallow this dreadful story, you have to create mythology. And Ilan Pappé has actually taken the 10 commonest myths that you hear all the time, like, as I just talking about, Zionism is Judaism, that the Palestinians left voluntarily in 1948 of their own accord or under orders from their leaders, or Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, let me pause there a second, just to say that this is so absurd. A glance at the reality makes you understand this is not a democracy. Because as you all know, the area between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, all that area is under Israeli control. Now, the people who live in that area, roughly speaking, can be divided into about 50% Palestinians and 50% Jewish Israelis and some Palestinians also within that section. That is the reality. But it is also the case that the 50% of the Palestinians ruled by Israel have no rights whatsoever. They have no citizenship, they have no rights, and the other half does have citizenship and rights. Immediately, you understand, that is no democracy. So you don't actually have to exercise your brain a lot. Yeah. Perhaps I ought to pause and then maybe.
No, I'm really listening. I mean, these 10 myths. It is similar to the Churchill thing of building a myth up and the cult, and then and history is often the way that you can exploit the present. If you tell a story about history that isn't the truth, then you can make whatever you want of the current situation.
That's right.
I mean, it's and then to think that at the same time we have a media that doesn't represent what's actually happening in the present time, and then to face the history being misrepresented as well, it's such a almost, it must be overwhelming to think of it. It's more, could I just use the word bullshit? More bullshit is coming in all the time and has to be rebutted all the time on top of all the stuff in the past. I mean, this must be so hard for you to kind of face all that, you know, like the week when the journalist was shot a couple of weeks ago. I mean,
Yeah, Shireen Abu Akleh.
another episode that's been pushed away under the carpet. You know, like this hasn't happened. It's relentless, isn't it?
Well, you see, the reason that kind of thing works, you know, that it can be pushed under the carpet, is because the context has already been created, and it's a false context, which is that there's them and us. You know, there's Israelis on one side, there's Palestinians on the other. They're always fighting and squabbling, and you know, and so it's all fitted into that framework. Once you clear the fog and understand the framework is settler colonialism, and that the settler colonial power is Israel, and that Israel has an ongoing campaign to take more Palestinian land and get rid of the people, the native population. That's what Zionism was about. Take the land, get rid of the natives. That's what it's about. And it's not never changed. It's never changed. But you see, once you're able to clear, as I say, the fog of misapprehension and lies and falsehoods about this,
yeah,
then you see what you've got. And the moment you understand that, all the events can be fitted very logically into that framework, clearly. And Ilan ends on a myth that the two-state solution is the only solution. And he really very cogently attacks that, as many of us have done, and as Palestinians do, because what Palestinian acceptance there has been for the two-state solution idea is based on an awareness that something is better than nothing, that Palestinians who have been really consistently denied rights, killed, attacked, without really a champion at any official level. And by the way, I break off to say that does not apply to populations and people. Ordinary people do support Palestinians. Governments in the West do not. And now when Palestinians have seen that, the imbalance of power between them and Israel, the darling of the West, many of them came to the conclusion, well, we'd better have a 20% of Palestine is better than nothing. Now, that idea, what one can understand, but of course, it was not only unfair, but it's not going to happen either, because if just a glance at the map, at the way that Israel is swallowing up Palestinian land as we speak, makes even that idea impossible. So he looks to the future, and a future I totally agree with, and I have argued for in my own book, Married to Another Man. There is only one way forward, and that is everybody has to live together in a genuine democracy, which represents its citizenry, rather than what we've got now. And if people could actually understand why that is the inevitable result of the Israeli destruction of Palestine and its attempted takeover of the whole of historic Palestine. If people really understand that, they'll see that there is no way forward other than for Israeli practices in order to keep the thing going, namely land theft, namely apartheid, discriminating against non-Jews in favor of Jews. Once people understand that these things not only are not acceptable, but they have no future, I think that, you know, people will agree with Ilan Pappé and myself and many others that the only way forward is to replace what we've got now, which is a settler colonial apartheid state, with a democracy that represents its citizens, where everybody enjoys equal rights, whatever their origin or their religion.